So we know what facilitation is. Now let's look at the attributes of effective facilitation. And essentially, the first one is to do with human conduct and values. So that's the way we treat people. Secondly, there's a set of key skills that make up a competency that we could call the core practices of facilitation. And finally, you probably know that facilitators like writing on walls and doing things like that. And these are sets of tools that they use in doing facilitation. So we're going to go through these so you get a clear idea of what they're about, which will be developed in context later. Okay, human conduct, well, let's try to work with factual data, basically. Let's try to give people choice. So when we work with students, we encourage them to have a degree of choice in their projects and how they do it. Important thing, within the parameters, of course, of time and assessment. And we talked earlier about in facilitation, we want to develop rapport. It's an important aspect. So trust, commitment to group goals, and concern and compassion for our members. So that's the human conduct thing. I would argue that these should apply in teaching in most human situations anyway, but let's move on. Okay, now, all of these have come up at once because I'm not going to go through them all. I will say a few things. You can download the slides and you can think about it. But good facilitators are good at certain things, and they're usually pretty good at thinking quickly. So if you're a bit of a slow thinker, you might have a bit of work to do. Sensory acuity means that they're very good at observing and listening to what's going on in the group. They can pick up if people understand things. They can pick up if people are feeling anxious or disengaged, or even getting into a kind of aggressive type mode. Very important in facilitation to read the mood, the feelings of the group, and that's through good observation and good listening. Sometimes in facilitation you have to deal with value-laden issues, and it's important for the facilitator to stay neutral. As we've said, good listening skills, not just listening, but trying to understand the position, the meaning, how that person feels, where are they coming from. And again, when things are being talked about, we've got to make sure that the assumptional base of what's being talked about is valid, and is it value laden, and if it is, we need to make it explicit. One of the big skills is to make meaning. There's all this information flying around. How do we pull it together and help people to make meaning that's useful for their goals? And related to that, as we said, there's a lot of information flying around, and that's why we use a range of organising process tools to capture this information so it can be reflected on. Another key skill is the ability to ask good questions, and that's something that we're going to develop through this tutorial. It's a big skill, and good facilitators are able to ask the right questions at the right time, and that connects obviously to quick thinking, doesn't it? With a lot of information flying around and people saying things that may not be terribly clear, the ability to look at what's being said, and more importantly to hear what's being said, and if it's not clear, to get the person to perhaps rephrase it. So you might paraphrase it in a particular way, spin it back to people until you get an authentic representation of intent and meaning. Feedback is central. That's an ongoing process. You may at any stage say to the group, look, this is where I think we are, and you're checking their understanding, you're checking their motivation, you're checking that you're moving in the right direction. Staying on track, I'm trying to do that as I go through this slide. Occasionally when you do facilitation, people may go off track. You may even go off track. Well, you've got to make decisions about how far you go off track, but you can't go off track for too long. And also, you don't want to go off track if it's going nowhere. And finally, at periodic times, and particularly at the end, to deal with all this information is to be able to pull it together in good summaries. So there's a hell of a lot of skills there. To do all these well is a very high level competence. Okay, process tools. Well, what do we mean by that? These essentially are tools that capture information, help us to engage in information, and to use that information for hopefully better decision making. And there are different types of tools for different types of intention. Again, here's the complete picture. There's tools that help us to to gather information, organise information. You're probably familiar with some of these, certainly a process flow chart. Sometimes we want to get people generating new ideas. Sometimes can we come up with something new and creative? And brainstorming, you probably all know, and mind mapping is pretty familiar. These are information generating tools, hopefully to generate some new ideas. But at some stage, we've got all this information, we want to use it to make decisions. And again, there are organising tools, plus minus interesting, quite a famous one from Edward de Bono, that we can use to get that information into structure. So it reduces cognitive load and we can focus on key things. There's tools that help us to take action. Again, they don't make the decision, but they help us to frame a process of thinking. 5 W's and H. We're probably familiar with that. What, where, why, and how. Those kind of things. And sometimes that when we're dealing with a lot of information, there's emotions flying around, and we have to deal with emotions and conflict, and there's tools for that. A very famous one is Edward de Bono's Thinking Act, where it helps to control the communication process so there isn't too many things flying around at once. Basically, here's the important point here, that these facilitation tools, process tools, do not improve the quality of thinking if there is no quality of thinking in the first place. What they are is combinations, essentially, of words, lists, organised around lines, circles, boxes, graphs and pictures. I'm reading this because this is such an important point. They are used to enable groups to bring together ideas and make decisions. But in themselves, they don't necessarily improve the quality of thinking, but they can facilitate better thinking through the management of information. So the ability to use these process tools is pretty important in good facilitation. So that's your basic overall summary of what facilitators do. They're pretty much nice people who treat people fairly, who have got some very good interpersonal skills, and they can use a variety of organising tools, information generation tools, and other types of tools to get the group to achieve, as far as is possible, what the group want to achieve.